The gate hung open, and nobody moved to close it. 3 trucks sat parked along the fence line outside McCook, Nebraska, engines off, breath fogging in the January air. Beyond the fence, corn stood in rows, brown, dry, 7 feet tall, while every other field for 40 miles lay flat and empty. Cattle moved slow between the stalks, heads down, working through husks that still clung to the ears. Walt Pruitt stood at the gate longest of anyone. He said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. But to understand what they were seeing, you have to go back 4 months, to the day Eli Cross did something everyone in the county said was a mistake. Sometimes the thing that looks like giving up is actually the only plan that was ever going to work. Subscribe for more true stories like this, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The Cross farm sat on 210 acres that Eli's father had run for 18 years before a tractor rollover left him unable to work the harvest. That left Eli, 16, and his older sister Mara, home from her second year of agricultural college, to bring in a corn crop neither of them had planned to manage alone. The bank held a note for $31,000, due in March. Mara had spent 2 years studying soil science and grain economics, knowledge the older farmers around McCook mostly waved off as classroom talk. Eli had none of that. What he had was 6 years of walking this ground with his father, and a habit of noticing things other people rushed past. One evening in September, standing at the edge of the west field, Mara said it almost as a joke, sometimes the smartest thing a farmer does is nothing at all. Eli didn't answer. He just kept looking at the corn. By early October, grain prices had dropped and diesel costs had climbed high enough that hauling and drying the crop would cost nearly as much as the corn was worth. Mara brought up a method she had studied that fall, leaving corn standing in the field through winter instead of harvesting it in autumn. Then letting cattle graze the stalks and drop ears directly. Agricultural researchers call it standing corn grazing, and it works because mature corn kernels hold their feed value even after the plant dries. While the husk offers the cattle some natural protection from early snow. Eli didn't announce a decision. He just stopped scheduling the combine. Walt Pruitt, who had farmed the section next door for 31 years, drove over in late October and stood at the fence a long while. "You're leaving good corn to rot, son," he said. Eli answered, "It's not rotting. It's wetting." Walt shook his head and left without another word. By November, people at the feed store were calling it Cross's Folly. Eli heard the name. He kept feeding the herd. In late November, Eli walked the west field alone at dusk and noticed something nobody else had bothered to check: the cattle were gaining weight, not losing it. Even as the temperature dropped into the 20s. He didn't tell Mara that night. He didn't tell anyone. He just wrote the number down in a notebook he kept in his coat pocket, and went back inside. The real test came in December. A hard freeze settled over the county for 11 straight days, temperatures falling to 11 degrees below zero, and a foot of snow buried most exposed pasture in the region. Neighbors who had already harvested were now paying for trucked-in hay at $9 a bale, a cost that ate through their margins fast. On the Cross farm, the standing stalks held firm through the storm. And the husks that still clung to the ears kept enough kernels shielded that the cattle could keep working through them even under snow cover. But the winter tested more than the corn. A water line to the stock tank froze and cracked on December the 9th, and Eli spent a sleepless night thawing pap with a torch borrowed from a neighbor, hands numb by 2 in the morning. 3 days later, a rumor moved through town that the Cross place was losing cattle to the cold, a rumor with no truth in it but enough weight to worry the bank. Eli didn't sleep much that week. So many nights he stood at the fence and wondered if Walt had been right after all, if he'd staked his father's farm on a theory from a textbook. Mara found him there once and said only, "The corn's still standing." "So are we." He didn't answer, but he went back to work. Through it all, the fields held. The cattle kept their weight. And by the last week of December, the herd had used less than half the winter feed budget Eli's father had spent the year before. Walt showed up uninvited on the 2nd of January, driving slow past the gate before pulling in. He walked the west field without asking, checked a cow's flank with his hand, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, never seen corn hold like that in January. He didn't apologize. He just went to his truck, came back with a spare tank heater Eli badly needed, and installed it himself in the cold without being asked. "Figured you could use this," he said. Eli thanked him. There was no triumph in it, only relief. Ward moved through the feed store differently after that. 2 neighbors, the Delaney's and old Frank Sabo, drove out separately in the following weeks just to walk the field and ask questions Eli hadn't expected anyone to ask. Frank borrowed Eli's notebook one afternoon to copy down the feed cost numbers by hand. Nobody called it Cross's Folly anymore. At the feed store counter, the conversation had quietly turned from corn yields to grazing days, and Walt was the one bringing it up. What looked, in October, like a boy giving up on his own harvest was never a retreat at all. It was a decision made with more patience than anyone around him had credit for. The corn that stood through January wasn't standing by accident. It was waiting to be understood, the same way Eli had been waiting, quietly, for the season that would prove what he already knew. Sometimes the smartest thing a farmer does really is nothing at all, nothing but trust the plan, and let the field do the rest. If this reminded you that patience can be its own kind of harvest, leave a comment below. Subscribe for more stories about people who were right before anyone else believed them.